Thanks, Anthony. Going to Rushanara, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I've got a quick supplementary on Ppu contracts. Mr. Davis, you talked about transparency and you've mentioned £10 billion of extra money that could have been saved, or taxpayers' money. And this issue about conflict of interest not being taken into account, all these concerns around different lanes, priority lanes, and reports, of course, we heard right through the last year, reports of civil servants being, cast to one side when these fast lanes were created, reports of to those with links to the Conservative Party, and that to many that would be tantamount to corruption, certainly to the public. And I appreciate your point about a lack of evidence to make that particular allegation stick, but there's a big issue about transparency and waste of public money. Can you talk more about where you think the government could have avoided these conflict of interests during what's happened? Of course, lessons can be learned for the future, but we need, people will expect answers given the catastrophic waste of public money, but also this cronyism that has overtaken the current discourse, political discourse at the moment, which is damaging for our country.
Yeah, obviously, I give in my role as the auditor, I can give you the good practice in managing these risks, and that's why I make the point about the kind of basic standards in this situation they don't need to be set aside, even though you're moving very fast to save lives and procure the equipment as rapidly as possible. And so government commissioned its own investigation into a different aspect of procurement actually in the pandemic from Nigel Boardman, who obviously has since been commissioned to do a different review, but he published that review around just after we did ours in late 2020. And he came to the same conclusion that actually government at the centre needed much clearer guidance that in an emergency, these minimum standards must not be set aside, whatever the pressure. And this is how you deliver proper transparency and very fast procurement. And I think that government is working on that now.
And yet, time and again, we heard that as an excuse for lack of transparency. In fact, many of us have raised these questions for months and months, and the emergency has been used as an excuse. And that excuse being justified for wasting taxpayers' money, billions of pounds. So the question is, who's going to pay? That's what the public want to know the answer to. Or are we just going to, just carry on as if nothing's happened?
Well, obviously, our job is to report our findings, and which we do publicly. And as you know, the Public Accounts Committee takes nearly all of our reports and holds hearings based on their findings and takes evidence directly from the civil servants responsible for the spending, and that happened in this case as well. So that's the mechanism that my organisation is part of, and we will continue to audit the high risk areas and make recommendations.
Reports are very important in the transparency debates, of course. Just in relation to in relation to what happens next. Do you think that there are lessons around the emergency legislation? Do you think that the emergency legislation gave scope? Did government ministers see that as sort of giving them? Some people would argue that's been used as an excuse for a lack of transparency, and there's a lesson perhaps to learn from there as well. Do you think that's something that we should be thinking about?
I think that's an important, well, there's lots of important reflections to do following this experience. And I think that's a really important one, actually, is how do you get the enabling power that was required in that situation? Yeah. And be very upfront, actually, to say it may well be necessary in some cases to set aside competitive tendering, for example, if you need it tomorrow rather than in a few weeks' time. But in that situation, here are the emergency minimum standards that must still be applied. And I think that'll be a very reasonable piece of learning to take out of this and to build into any future such legislation.
Thank you. So moving back onto bounce back loans and picking up on some of the points the chair raised, the fees and the British Business Bank had estimated that between 35 and 60% of the bounce back loans may not be repaid. And you've touched on that earlier. That's between 16 billion and 27 billion based on loans to date. Just in terms of what next, did the fraud controls by the banks on bounce back loans improve over time? And was that at the instigation of government?
There were changes over time in how the bounce back loan scheme operated. It closed at the end of March, just gone. At the time we were doing our report, of course, which was the field work for that was in September, October time. We haven't done the detailed work since then to be able to track any changes that government has made and who instigated them in response to your question. So I can't help you with the detail of that. Joshua might be able to come in on the broader point.
So just to give some examples of the improvement, one of the first steps was removing duplicate loans by sharing information between lenders. So that's something that they brought in. They brought in best practice sharing of the fraud risk, and actually that sounds like quite a small thing, but it's quite a big thing to have actually got the lenders talking to one another about the nature of the risks they were seeing and how to respond to that. They made improvements to the reporting of fraud, which meant that there is at least some intelligence flow to the centre about what sort of frauds were being done. They commissioned NATIS, which is the National Investigation Service. It's a police-led organisation to look at the more serious organised crime and serious frauds that they were finding. And finally, they started their back in the autumn their lender audits to actually assess whether or not lenders were doing essentially the three main checks they would do, which are the anti-fraud, the anti-money laundering, and the know your client or know your customer checks. So these are kind of like the list of things they were doing. There's still that sense that could they have done more? How do they actually get the information to know what was going on? And this is you also get that sense it's a very disaggregated system. So you've got the centre trying to influence a risk that the centre holds through the guarantee, but which the banks are responsible for managing.
Right. And earlier on, Mr. Davis talked about borrowers, a scenario where you might find borrowers not seeking to repay and not coming forward. Out of that sort of group, what proportion do you think of those people are the ones that are involved in organised crime versus those who may have other reasons why they're not coming forward?
We just don't have any data on that, so I can't help you at all, I'm afraid. And actually, I'm not until we get to May and those first bits of evidence start coming in. Yeah. I think it'll be difficult. I think we do know that the banks themselves, of course, are doing some work to correlate commercial loans that they have made themselves anyway to businesses in the past, and where they've also then paid a bounce back loan to that business. They are trying to spot patterns where people are starting to default on their existing commercial loans to the bank because they're expecting that to also feed through into the bounce back loan. So government, we know, is through the British Business Bank, is talking to the lenders about that sort of evidence that they're building up as well.
And in your report, you talked about you made calls for robust debt collection with lenders and fraud investigation arrangements. Can you say a bit more, either of you or all three of you, a bit more about what discussions you've had with ministers and other agencies to pursue to make that happen?
Joshua, do you want to come in on that?
So, of course, what discussions with ministers? I don't know, Gareth, what discussions you've had with ministers. The normal process is that we make the reports to Parliament, and then there was the hearing of the Committee of Public Accounts. So that led to their report, and there was a Treasury minute, and there was a process by which it's done. So this is all pretty much done at an official level, unless Gareth has had a separate meeting with ministers.
Yeah, Not specifically on that question, no.
Are you confident that robust measures would be, do you feel confident in light of the Public Accounts Committee reports? I mean, I noticed some of the responses from government, but do you feel confident that robust debt collection with lenders and fraud investigation arrangements will take place?
Too early for us to say. I think there's some good plans in place, and we talked about some of the lender audits that Joshua described. I think that's going to be a big source of evidence. The kind of central challenge here is incentivizing lenders who are not carrying the financial risk to pour resources into detection and recovery, and that's a lot of the work the government's doing is to kind of address that central kind of incentive problem, because one of the reasons why these loans were able to be made much more quickly was the 100% guarantee from government. So that's what they're grappling with, but we are following up our bounce back loan recommendations later this summer, and we'll be reporting on the evidence that we've pulled together on exactly that question.
Thank you. Just one final question for you, Mr. Davis, on the Greensill inquiry. Obviously, it begs the question, are there other cases? Could there have been other cases where, particularly with the British Business Bank, and BIS and the connections between the two, whether there could be a kind of contamination of lobbying and then improper influencing, and so on? Will you be picking up on and looking at whether, as well as lessons, whether there may be other cases like this? Because the public will be concerned about whether this is a widespread pattern of behaviour in terms of lobbying and its impact.
We were right at the start of the work that I described at the beginning of the meeting, and so too early, because we just don't have the evidence to be able to answer that question yet. But obviously, like any audit, we have a specific scope that we're tackling, but we pick up any threads that identifies as we go. So we'll have the same methodology here. If there's an apparent connection to other cases, we will follow that up. We won't just leave it, but too early to say whether that will be the case.
Thank you very much.